Did gain-of-function research cause the pandemic? That was something Joe Rogan and comedian Jim Gaffigan were discussing on a recent episode of the podcast. Let's watch.
The way of doing that was to come up with some sort of a cure for coronaviruses when they came around. Well, they failed miserably at that because the mitigation efforts were very unsuccessful. They weren't prepared. They didn't know what to do. And they likely did create something that was way more contagious and wound up killing a load of people because it got out.
Wow.
Yeah, that's hard for people to think about and deal with. The fact that the scientific community that was involved in that is responsible for the direct deaths of who knows how many people worldwide. That's a terrifying thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably worse than bombing in a comedy club.
Yeah.
No.
Imagine if you're one of the guys that was involved in that research and you realize that now.
Oh, my
like,
God.
Holy maybe your mom died of it and directly because of stuff that you were working on. Yeah. It's terrifying.
And people just kind of, well, I think, people kind of sit there and go, well, this is my job. This is research. I don't necessarily understand it, but I'm doing this.
Yeah. And there's also money in the cure. There's money in the treatment and an insane amount of money that gets pushed around. That's when people get real crazy and think that it was leaked on purpose so that they can make money off the treatment, which is the most evil way to look at it.
I don't know, Jim Gaffigan didn't necessarily seem to be buying what Joe Rogan was selling there, or didn't seem super, maybe there's more comments where he goes into it in greater depth. He was just saying, yeah, man, I don't know, that's bad.
Yeah, I mean, he's known as being a pretty clean, straight down the middle comic, famous for his Hot Pocket spit.
It's a funny routine. I think I've said to you that I don't appreciate a lot of comedy routines very much. I do like that routine. I remember watching that and thinking it was funny.
Yeah, he's a delight. So, I mean, it does, I think, speak to, look, when you have kind of mainstream, politically neutral, I would have perceived him to be sort of left-leaning, but apparently maybe he's not, but he was anti-Trump. Who knows?
He's religious, which is right-leaning, but it's Catholic, which is actually Democrat-leaning, so
who knows? We're trying to read the tea leaves here, but it is interesting to note that after a short period of time where Joe Rogan was seemingly very toxic to anyone who wanted to have any kind of mainstream traction in kind of liberal spaces like Hollywood, it seems that's not the case anymore, and people have kind of bent the knee to the reality that he is the biggest name in the business, and if you want, it's a real mitzvah to be invited on the show.
Crazy things he said about COVID don't seem as crazy anymore now that the what is it called? The window of
Overton window.
The Overton window. That's it. Has shifted, I think, pretty dramatically in both the public opinion and even what experts are. I mean, we're reading their messages. We know what the experts were conceding at the beginning of the pandemic. I saw Zeynep Tufekci, who is a commentator for the New York Times on health and COVID issues. She's had a lot of well-informed takes over the course of the pandemic. I agree with some of them. I disagree with a lot of others. But she's been going after, I think, implicitly, she was actually going after the New York Times as well for how it's handled the proximal origins disclosures. She was fighting with Will Stansel, who's I hate, and you probably do too.
I don't know that I know enough to
it all. For saying that he was saying today that there's no chance that there was a lab leak. Nathan Robinson responded to it and was like, what are you, how can you say there's no
anyone
evidence?
Who's that confident about anything?
The gain of function people, they all thought there was some evidence. We've read their messages.
It's maddening. It's maddening. And to get into the more, I would say, less substantiated and, as Rogan put it, evil part of the analysis there, the idea that there's a profit in the cure. I think that's the part of it that is a little flimsier to substantiate, although we do have the stories about someone like Bill Gates selling, what was it, 31.4 billion. No, sorry. Pfizer announced $31.4 billion of record sales, basically buying Pfizer stock and then offloading it after the pandemic, and then immediately after offloading the stock, starting to downplay or be openly critical of the vaccine.
Right.
The idea that you profited, whether or not you were causing it is different.
Inhaler. Remember that?
Right. Like pivoting to new therapeutics that you happen to have just invested in, right? So that's not saying, even Joe Rogan, that's not an argument that he caused the pandemic or supported the pandemic, but it is of course true that there are many people who profited off of it. And interrogating the relationship between the funding of these kinds of vaccines, the origin of the vaccine, the funding of gain-of-function research, the liability implications for those that were involved, not to mention the moral culpability, as they were alluding to, of the people involved. Those are very weighty questions that up until this point have been largely sidestepped because of the public refusal to read any intentionality or any relationship between a lab and the COVID pandemic.
Right. I mean, there are obviously some people talking about deliberate release for various reasons, profit incentive, or biowarfare, et cetera.
Like RFK.
That's not really where I think the evidence is at right now. I don't see a lot of people talking about that. Most people are coming around to the idea, and if you look at polling, we discussed this last week, there was, in this very flawed New York Times report, in my view, on proximal origins and all that, there was actual polling of what people think. Overwhelming majority of people think it was a lab leak. Not deliberate, accidental but negligent, given that this was being done in unsafe conditions, and the scientists knew there were all kinds of concerns, and there was, again, President Obama put a pause on this research for a reason. They did it anyway. That's where public opinion is. That's increasingly what the experts are conceding. And it's just gaslighting to say there's no evidence for it.
Yeah, 2/3 of Americans, to your point, according to a March YouGov poll, say that they
it's
believe
not a partisan issue.
Leak.
It's not, and there's nothing at stake for Republicans or Democrats in it. There's something at stake for the federal health establishment and our funding priorities. But that's not it's not Republicans win, Democrats lose if this.
What do you think would happen if Joe Biden came out, given this kind of consensus that's evolved, and said, look, we were misled by a lot of politicians and medical experts about the possible origins. And I myself have been moved on this issue, and I think we absolutely need to do more investigation into lab leak, and I plan to shut down funding to gain-of-function research until we know more. And if that's a chief concern of yours, that we don't make the same mistakes that we made in the pandemic going forward, know that I have been moved by the arguments that have been made by people across the political spectrum. And I look forward to paying more attention to that in my next term now that I have successfully guided you out of the crisis.
I think that would be fantastic. Just as you credited the good advice I gave to Ron DeSantis earlier for what he should say, Joe Biden would be so well served to say that. I think that would be a great thing for him to say.
Do you think it would alienate mainstream liberals out of voting for him?
Well, no. Would it hurt him with actual voters? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
But it would hurt him, I think, some of the media pundit type people who are so bought into, well, it's a racist conspiracy theory. I think it's a lab leak, who have only begrudgingly eased off that. They don't want him to say that. And the people he surrounds himself with take their cues, I think. I've said this before, and why I don't think Kamala Harris would be swapped out. They take their cues from expert media people and this exact category who would be offended, who is not a significant voting constituency, but has undue influence on
Rick
the Democratic
Wilson
president.
of the Lincoln Project.
Exactly.
It's that group. Yeah.
Exactly. So they won't advise him to say that. They won't want him to say that. He would have to, just do it of his own volition. That would be great if he let that rip at the State of the Union. Fantastic.
It would just neuter so much of the conservative. Energy. I mean, people will say you're doing it in bad faith. But honestly, his national security
advisors might tell him not to say that too, because we don't want to make China upset or something.
It just seems, I don't know. When you look at the energy that someone like RFK Jr. has been able to capture by simply giving voice to what I think are some legitimate concerns about the CDC and COVID guidance. Why I'm not saying engage in some of the unsubstantiated kinds of conspiracy theory, but there's so much there that is substantiated. It's so odd to pick that particular hill to die on. And if you're a mainstream Democrat who knows that someone like RFK Jr. is able to get to 20% of the polls challenging you, basically coasting on the idea that folks are tired of being gaslit about how they've been experiencing the world for the last 3 years, why wouldn't you just relax on that one issue, which frankly at this juncture in the pandemic cycle has little to no bearing on the way you're ruling, especially since Biden, he ended the pandemic. He's happy to have the pandemic behind him. If anything, he should be getting criticism, I would argue, for not doing more to continue to support people who have long COVID and are continue to be vulnerable to a disease which still is out there. But he has benefited both politically and substantively in terms of his own policy choices with saying that it's lab leak and that people had legitimate reasons to be concerned, and the CDC, and placing the blame for the shutdowns on organizations that didn't have not a direct bearing on him and his own political agenda. So it's an interesting choice. Maybe it is this national security issue that's preventing him from doing that. But as a consequence of his position, there's a wide lane open for a lot of people to still capitalize on frustrations around the pandemic.
For sure. More Rising right after this.